Over the past couple of years, terms like pandemic, quarantine, and infection have flooded the headlines. Life as we know it virtually came to a standstill as entire nations shut down in the wake of a new strain of coronavirus. The physical health of oneself and loved ones went from pretty much being an afterthought to the number one concern in the minds of many. Now, the impact of this disease went far beyond the physical plane. Looking back, health officials are now beginning to realize the severe psychological, sociological, and emotional tolls experienced not only from those who caught the virus, but even for those who were never physically infected. I think it's fair to say we were all touched and continue to be by this ongoing pandemic. Now, infectious disease is certainly nothing new. In the time of Jesus, the most dreaded disease was not COVID-19, it was leprosy. Among first century Jews, a single word could clear a room, and that word was unclean. If somebody shouted unclean, people scattered. They didn't have to be told about social distancing in the first century. When it came to leprosy, you kept your distance because you did not want to be infected. Leprosy was widespread in the time of Christ. It's apparent not only from the several lepers that Jesus encountered in his ministry, but also the many instructions that were given in the Jewish laws of that day, the common rules that governed everyday life for the Jews. Scribes counted as many as 72 different afflictions that were defined as leprosy. As was mentioned earlier, the Mosaic Law devotes 2 entire chapters to how to deal with leprosy and those who are infected by it, Leviticus 13 and 14. And it was a disease for which the law prescribed quarantine from the rest of society. So lepers were outcasts in their community. They were forbidden to have contact with their family, their friends, their neighbors. And it took from them not only their health, but it was really a sentence imposed on them, a sentence of isolation. It robbed them of their name, their occupation, their habits, their family, their friends, even their ability to go to worship. Like a corpse, the leper could impart impurity to objects found within the same enclosure. As a result, a leper in those days was considered a walking corpse. We've got a TV show called The Walking Dead. That's what the lepers were considered back then. They were walking corpses. And a cure for leprosy was likened to raising a dead person. Philip Yancey, in his book, Where is God When It Hurts?, singles out leprosy as probably the most hopeless of all diseases. So with that in mind, that we turn to Mark chapter 1. We've begun a series of studies in the life of Christ, his one-on-one encounters with individuals. Yes, Jesus ministered to the multitudes, but many times his focus was on one individual. And I believe we can learn a lot from these incidents in Christ's life, how he dealt with them, and how we are called to deal with others in similar circumstances. Now, in a parallel passage in Matthew chapter 8, it says Jesus at this time was coming down of the mountainside with large crowds following him. In Matthew's gospel, he had just preached the Sermon on the Mount. So there was a large entourage coming with Jesus. And into that setting comes a man who is described as a leper. I'm sure the people cleared out when they saw this man coming. It's not recorded in the scripture that he cried out, "Unclean, unclean." We're not sure that he did that. But certainly the people would have recognized the symptoms of the disease and kept their distance. Dr. Luke in his gospel states that the man was full of leprosy. It would have been at an advanced stage. He may have lost fingers or toes. Some lepers even lost their nose. Their skin would literally rot away. It was a grotesque scene, and people would have backed away from him. This man takes a huge risk approaching Jesus, and this is the condition Jesus encountered. A man's coming up to him with this dreaded, very contagious disease. It was a great risk for this leper as well, because as I mentioned, there were strict rules regarding how they could act, where they could go, and particularly where they could not go, which was where well people were. A later rabbinic tradition sentenced lepers to 40 lashes for entering precincts forbidden to them. None of that mattered to this leper, though. He needed to come to Jesus. And so he broke the customs of the day, even some of the laws of the day, in order to make his way to Jesus. Could you imagine the crowd gasping as they're backing away? I imagine some of them were thinking, if they didn't say out loud, the nerve of that person. How dare he come into our space? Now, there's two surprises that we find in this encounter. The first, I kind of alluded to, there's no mention of him shouting, unclean, unclean. That was what they were supposed to do. The second is the way the man speaks to Jesus. He doesn't ask for cleansing in the form of a question. He makes it a statement. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And I think this really reveals the heart of the leper. First, he acknowledges his condition. He's unclean. He knows it. He's not denying it. He's not minimizing it. But he also displays remarkable humility. He doesn't blame God. You don't sense a spirit of entitlement, like, okay, God, you owe me. You'd better heal me. No, he says, if you are willing. He has no doubt of the ability of Jesus to heal. The faith is there. There's another encounter that Jesus has with someone, and he says, if you can, help me. And Jesus says, what do you mean, if I can? Is there anything impossible for God? This guy doesn't have that issue. He knows that Jesus can heal, but he does not demand it. He says, if you are willing. And that's humility. That is acknowledging Jesus is God, and he gets the final say. Now, as I was preparing this message, I came across scholars, teachers, pastors, who take issue with this man's approach. You don't say, if it is the Lord's will, because it's always the Lord's will to heal. You just go in and demand your healing. You name it, you claim it, and it's yours. But I don't see Jesus rebuking this man at all for a lack of faith. This is not a lack of faith. In fact, this is a tremendous statement of faith. Not only do I believe that you can heal me, but I also believe you're the one who can make that choice. It's on your agenda, not mine. You almost get the sense of the prayer of Jesus in the garden, not my will, but yours be done, which I believe is the proper attitude. Yes, we know God can heal, but we also know that God sometimes has a better idea. And so it's His will that we ultimately seek. And that's what this man does. But we see that this leper risked everything. He's breaking both law and custom on the chance of being healed and being restored by Jesus. And no obstacle was going to prevent him from coming. So let's move on to the compassion Jesus expressed. it asks the question, how would Jesus react? But before we get there, maybe it'd be better to ask, how would I react? What if I was there? What if I was one of Jesus' disciples? Or maybe I was one of the crowds that had heard him teaching and preaching, and all of a sudden, a leper comes into the midst. Would I scramble for cover, fearful of being contaminated? Would I react violently with words or actions to let this idiot know exactly what I think of his thoughtlessness? Would I avert my face from the stomach-turning sights and sounds of this individual? Jesus did none of those things. In Mark's account, the first 3 words of verse 41 show his response: filled with compassion. Now, it is true, there are some copies of the Gospel of Mark where the word is filled with indignation. And it's not that it's the same Greek word, it's a different word. There's some question as to which the original was. It's not impossible that both aren't true. But if Jesus was filled with indignation, it wasn't at the man. It would have been at his disease. It would have been at the sight of what sin had done to this person whom Jesus had created. But the word here in the New International Version is filled with compassion. It comes from a vivid Greek verb that derives from the word for the inward parts. Literally, it means guts. It's that gut feeling that moves someone very deeply. As a human, Jesus expressed the powerful feelings of compassion as he sees another human in need. You know how it is when you walk by a scene that just breaks your heart. When you watch or you hear of a tragic story, or you read about it in the paper, you're moved with compassion for those who hurt. Your heart goes out to them. You literally hurt for them. Reminded of an incident that happened many, many years ago. Some of you that follow sports will remember the name Joe Theismann. He was a quarterback for the Washington Redskins. Pretty popular name, rather successful. One Monday night, the Redskins were playing the New York Giants. And some of you are already groaning. You know where I'm going here. And on a play, the Giants linebacker, Lawrence Taylor, comes around the end, sacks the quarterback, Joe Theismann. On his way down, Theismann's leg breaks. Right in between the knee and the ankle. I mean, it snaps and you can see it. And of course, it's Monday Night Football, so they're going to show it like in super slow motion from every conceivable angle, right? And at this particular time, I was at my brother's house. Bob and I are watching the game. Carol had stepped out. She comes into the living room, and literally, Bob and I are doubled over and groaning. Oh, my goodness. Carol must have thought there was something wrong with supper. I don't know. What is going on here? We're like, look. When you see something like that, you feel it. You feel so much for that person, you can almost feel their pain. That's the idea about this compassion. Jesus ached for this man. But it didn't stop with that feeling. Now, some translations say moved with pity or filled with pity. And these two words, pity and compassion, are often interchangeable, but I think there's a big difference. Pity is defined as sympathetic sorrow for one suffering, distressed, or unhappy. Compassion is defined as sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it. There's a difference. Joseph Bailey writes, a scale of human virtues would probably rank compassion rather low and pity rather high. I mean, what's the difference, since both involve sympathy and sorrow for a distressed person? It's that little phrase, together with a desire to alleviate the distress. Few Americans would have the reaction one man who saw pictures of emaciated, hollow-eyed, starving children on TV and said, "Well, they ruined my breakfast." I mean, almost everybody pities the children, and with no small pity. But only a few are moved to compassion to do something about it. Pity is a dangerous emotion. It inures us to suffering of others. It spawns hypocrisy. It cuts the nerve of action. But compassion triggers action. And that action is sometimes stirred towards people whose sufferings are so hidden that pity would never even be stirred to feel. This word compassion, it's a word often ascribed to Jesus throughout the Gospels. It was the supreme motive behind his service. He was deeply moved at the sight of human need, moved with compassion, and therefore moved to action. And that brings us to the contact Jesus experienced. Notice in verses 41 and 42. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched the man. Let that sink in for a minute. This guy still has leprosy. The last thing you want to do to someone with leprosy is reach out and touch someone. And Jesus touched him. Now, before you say, yeah, but he was the Son of God, he was immune to any kind of disease. Not so fast. He was 100% human. He could have caught that leprosy as much as anybody else. But he reached out and he touched him. He took that risk. And then it goes on. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. See, to feel with compassion is not enough. To feel bad for someone does not change their situation. James says that in his letter. If someone comes to the door and they're ill-clad, they're hungry, and you say, "God bless you, be well," and slam the door in their face, what good is that? Doesn't help them at all. Jesus did something about it. He reached out, he touched that man, risking every social taboo, violating every medical warning. Jesus let the leper know that he would take his place, not just physically, but socially as well. See, far from being repulsed from the man, Jesus reached out to him. Here is Jesus, the one fully human and fully divine, bringing a physical touch of gentle care to a desperately hurting man. I'm sure that Jesus not only saw the physical pain that this man was experiencing, but he also understood the loneliness, the isolation that he had experienced. Think about it. When was the last time anybody had ever touched this man? We don't know how long he had had the leprosy, but however long it had been, no one would touch him. Jesus touched him. And I think this tells us something about Jesus' compassion. You often see the word compassion in the Gospels ascribed to Jesus, but you also see a little word that follows, and the word is "and." Jesus felt compassion and did something about it. In Matthew chapter 20, Jesus had compassion on 2 blind men, and he healed them. In Mark 6, Jesus had compassion on the crowds of people, and he fed them. In Matthew 9, Jesus had compassion on the people, and he prayed for them. His compassion moved him to action. And you see this In so many of these one-on-one encounters with Jesus, he's moved with compassion. The feeling is there, but it doesn't stop there. He does something to touch that person in need. Whether it was in a crowd or with an individual, the sequence was the same. He saw, he felt, he acted. The movement was always from the eye to the heart, from the heart to the hand. He was always moved to do something about it. Now I ask you, were there risks involved? Absolutely. I believe there were physical risks. I believe there was also the risk, like he had experienced what we saw last week when he stopped and talked to the woman at the well in Samaria. He risked his reputation. He risked the acceptance of others in order to reach the one. Compassion can get you hurt. It can even get you killed. Now, Jesus was the pinnacle of compassion, and what happened to him? He was crucified. Another example of this, a little closer to our day and time, took place in the 19th century with a missionary named Joseph Damien. He ministered on the island of Molokai, Hawaii. And I already know what some of you are thinking. Oh yeah, I'd like to suffer for Jesus like that. But where he ministered was a leper colony. He would go to these individuals and he would share with them the love of God. He often led worship in this place where nobody else would go. And he would always begin his worship with the words, "My fellow believers." He showed them the love of God, the acceptance of God, and many of them responded. One Sunday morning, as he was getting ready to go to church, he poured a cup of hot water into a cup, make some tea, and some of the water splashed out and landed on his foot. And he didn't feel it. He had been around long enough to know what that meant. That Sunday morning, when he stood up before the group that he loved so much, instead of saying, "My fellow believers," he began with, "My fellow lepers." He had contracted the disease, and it ultimately took his life. Moved with compassion, he made contact, and he contracted their disease. And I'm sure that if you were to ask him, he would say, "I wouldn't do anything different." That is the heart of Jesus. That's what we are called to be and to do. There's always a risk. Maybe it's not the risk of physical infection. It may be social isolation. It may be being criticized, questioned, even ostracized because of the people you're willing to reach out to. Once compassion starts, nothing can stop it. But something that will stop compassion in its tracks is self-centeredness. When I start worrying more about myself, when I start worrying more about, am I safe? Is my reputation safe? Are people going to understand? Are people going to accept? When that gets in the way, compassion never gets off the ground. And nothing happens. We're like the priest and the Levite who walked by the man laying on the side of the road. It was the Good Samaritan who stopped and ministered to the man, who reached out to him and gave him what he needed. Don't be surprised when you begin to reach out to those nobody else would come within 10 feet of. If you're not questioned, if you're not criticized, you'll see a lot of attitudes that can be harsh and judgmental. You'll see people saying, "Well, it serves them right. They must have done something to deserve this." What are you doing trying to reach people like that? What we need today is compassion, not judgment, not even pity. We need compassion that moves us to action, regardless of the disease, regardless of the cost, because there is a cost. And that's the last thing we see in this account, the cost Jesus endured. Look at verses 43 and 45. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. See to it that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. These are very sharp words Jesus uses. Literally in the Greek, it says Jesus cast him out, threw him out. Go! Get out of here. Why? Maybe because he was fearful for the man's safety with all this crowd that he had exposed them to his disease. But why would he say, don't tell anybody? Go straight to the priest. Again, it may have been very practical. If you stop and tell people, they might think you're still sick, you're still infected, and you're still a hazard. You go straight to the priest. Maybe he was concerned that if he stopped to tell other people, he'd never get to the priest. And until the priest pronounced him clean, he wasn't clean, socially. But I think there was something else to it as well. I think Jesus knew what would happen when the man went and blabbed it to everybody, which, spoiler alert, he did. Verse 45 says, instead he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. He just told everybody he could think of. Now we'd say, that's great. I mean, here's someone that, Jesus touched him, and now he's telling everybody. In fact, it's a little bit ironic. Jesus tells this man, don't tell anyone. He tells everyone. He tells us, tell everyone, and we don't tell anyone, right? But there was a cost to Jesus. And the cost was, as a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. Jesus had a choice to make. Would he respond to this leper at the risk of limiting his ministry and prematurely provoking the opposition of the established religious leaders? Or would he reject the leper at the risk of losing the purpose for why he came, to seek and to save those who were lost? Jesus chose the leper, but it wasn't without a price. Instead of presenting himself to the priest, instead of entering the ritual for cleansing, the leper became a one-man whirlwind and spread the story of his cleansing everywhere he went. What a cost for compassion. Jesus had to give up his ministry in that city for the sake of a single soul. From now on, the people would have to come to him in out-of-the-way desert places. And more than that, the testimony of this leper set the edge of the legal opposition to Jesus. Conflict would now be constant for the rest of his life. That's the cost Jesus endured. You say, well, how does that apply to me? I like the way one commentator summarized this. He says, Mark began the story with Jesus on the inside and the leper on the outside. At the end of the story, Jesus is outside in the lonely places, while the leper has traded places. Early in his ministry, Jesus is already an outsider in human society. Mark casts him in the role of the servant of the Lord who bears the iniquities of others and whose bearing of them causes him to be numbered with the transgressors. As Julie mentioned in our communion meditation, leprosy is kind of a symbol for sin. And the way it infects us and the way it isolates us. Jesus came and took the sin for us. Now, it doesn't say Jesus contracted leprosy here, but he did become sin for us. He did take on himself the sin of mankind. to the point that his own father had to turn away from him. He died outside the camp, we're told in Hebrews, away from people. That was the cost of his compassion. And the risk of reaching out to the infected, whether literally or figuratively, is the risk of being associated with them. The risk of perhaps being marginalized, set aside, isolated along with them. Or it might even mean that we become very inconvenienced by many more who want what we are sharing. Compassion is costly to us emotionally and economically. Pity costs nothing. Compassion leads us to actions that's going to tax our feelings and our finances. When we choose to live as Jesus lived, we're going to be stretched thin, just like he was. As soon as one need is met, another bunch of needs arise. Are we willing to pay that price? The alternative to compassion is to play it safe. Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. What's our choice going to be? I'm reminded of the parable Jesus taught in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. I'm sure you're familiar with it. A man is about to go on a trip. He calls in 3 of his servants. He gives each of them an amount of money, and he says, you go and invest this, and when I come back, there'll be a review. 2 of them went out and doubled the investment. The third man dug a hole, stuck the money in the ground, and kept it there. When the man returns and calls in his servants, the first 2 show that they had doubled the man's investment, and he commends them. The third man says, well, I know you're a hard man, and so I played it safe. I dug a hole in the ground and buried your money. Here it is. It's all here. I didn't lose a penny of it. Maybe he was expecting to be commended for his conservatism. That wasn't the case. In fact, his master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on account with the bankers. At least then I'd have got interest. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10, and throw that worthless servant outside to the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's playing it safe. We're not called to be safe. We're called to trust God. We're called to imitate Jesus. We're called to sometimes take a risk to reach out and touch someone that nobody else will. To break those social conventions. To break the expectations of others who say, stay away. They're not safe. You show me one place in this word where we're called to be safe. We are called to be moved with compassion, and in that compassion to move to action. That's the life of Jesus, and that's the life we're called to. C.T. Studd was a famed missionary to 3 continents, and he wrote a little poem that goes like this. Some want to live within the sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue ship about a yard from hell. That's the kind of attitude Jesus is looking for. He wants us out there on the front lines, not safely back behind, cowering in fear. There are men and women and young people out in that world that are dying. They're lost. They're headed for an eternity in hell, and nobody wants to get near them. Who of us are going to do that? Who of us are going to be moved with compassion and do something about it? We may not be able to heal their disease, but even reaching out to them may be more comforting than any medication can be. As Jim Elliot put it, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. If you're so worried about your physical health and your physical life, here's a news flash: it's not going to last forever. We are to invest, not play it safe. Jesus did that. Will we?